Good evening. Now, let me see. Oh, only a very small number of participants have joined us so far. So I'll keep stalling while, here we come, more and more people joining us. Good evening to everybody joining us from wherever you're joining us, from across Norfolk, from across the UK. Maybe with luck, we have people from all across the world who are here to hear about Stephen's wonderful latest book. We're joined, of course, this evening by Stephen Rutt, joining us from home in Dumfries. Are you?
Yes, hello. Yeah, it's been a nice day in Dumfries, although it's the first day this summer without swifts. So a teeny bit bereft.
Do you know, I don't think I saw a swift today, and yesterday I certainly did. And today I have not noticed, but I've been reading and writing all day, and so I just happened at the time I looked at the sky, there were no swifts. But that's a really big moment in the year, isn't it, when the swifts have left?
It is. It is poignant and sad all in once.
Poignant and sad.
Yeah.
They are a great, great blessing. And it's a great blessing to have you with us here this evening, Stephen. We'll come back to you in just a moment. Good evening to everybody joining us from all over the world. It's lovely to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed. Now, the form for this meeting is just the same as the ones we've been doing for getting on for a year and a half now. If anyone has any questions, there's a Q&A box, which you can pop your question in. Some of you, we might bring you in live if you have a question to ask Stephen directly yourself. Some of you, depending on time and all that sort of thing, I might ask your questions to Stephen, but I'll try and cover as many questions as possible, unless there's a huge, huge flood of them. This is, of course, a Norfolk Wildlife Trust event, and it's a free event. However, should anyone feel they wish, excuse me, to make a donation, then David Fieldhouse, who's producing us from Norfolk, he's popping a link for making a donation in the chat. You will find that there. And you will also find very shortly a link through which you can buy Stephen's wonderful latest book. Matching copies. Now, I feel a bit sheepish because this copy very clearly says not for sale or quotation, and I'm going to quote it all evening at you. But here we have Stephen's lovely latest book, The Eternal Season. And through the link that David is popping in the chat, you can purchase this book. Not only can you purchase this book, you can purchase this book as well, which is Stephen's last book, Wintering, which came out, what, a year or so ago, maybe just a bit more?
Late September 2019.
2019, yeah, lovely. So a couple of years ago. And I don't actually have a copy of Seafarers, your previous book, but you can buy all three through the link that David is popping in the chat, to our wonderful friends at Wild Sounds and Books, who are great, great allies of Norfolk Wildlife Trust. They stock our visitor centre, and they are also very generous donors to conservation. And by making a purchase of any of Stephen's books, you will be making a donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust and the conservation work that we do. So thank you very much. As I say, do put questions in the chat. I don't think there's any more housekeeping that we need to do, so we may as well start with you, Stephen. You're going to begin, please, I think, with a reading from your latest beautiful book.
I am. I'm going to read about dragonflies, because I think we're still just about in dragonfly season. So you need to picture this. It is early June. It's lockdown. Actually, it's late May in lockdown, and I'm in Bedfordshire. I offer him my index finger. He takes it slowly, clambering up from the scalding tarmac of the road, one pair of legs at a time. The sensation is like having a spider crawl over my hand, the tickle of his leg bristles, the sure grip of the claw-like point of his foot, the surprise of his weightless body. Dragonflies look perfect, almost mechanical. This one is an emperor, a particularly robust example of the order, which is what prompted me to bend down and make my offer. You don't normally find emperors on country roads. In my hand, I can see the problem. His neck is broken. His head is wrenched around at 180 degrees. The guillotine of his jaws on top, eyes under. It takes a second for the ghastliness of it to sink in, while my mind scrabbles for reasons. Hit by a car, I guess, but only a glancing blow. A fatal wound, and a long, drawn-out death to come. In my hand, he is alive, one glorious last time. I am torn between the horror of the injury and the beauty of his body. The thorax, apple bright, adjoining an abdomen made of segments of brilliant kingfisher blue. A thick black line runs down the abdomen with spurs like painted vertebrae. It's the wings that really catch my eye. Normally they are a blur. Now their delicacy and strength are apparent. Thin black veins trace a honeycomb-like pattern through the transparent membrane with a milky tea-coloured pterostigma towards the tip. The hind wings are shorter but deeper, the inside edge curving towards the abdomen, where a narrow segment accommodates this kink. The leading edge of the forewing, the costa, is a pale lemon yellow. And then I'm back at the apple thorax, noticing a slight light downiness. And the problem, his perfect head, broken. I take the coward's way out. I can't kill him. I transfer him to a branch in the hedge and hope nature takes its course. A few days later, I return. These sunny days feel like a broadcast in high definition. The ring of trees and gently folded hills shine through the still air that holds them without haze. The road is quiet. And when I get back to the branch in the hedge, I find him in the grass beneath, his head gone, the thorax opened up and hollowed out, the faded abdomen a brittle shell, as thin as a cigarette paper. Tennyson saw on a dragonfly a living flash of light. For the poet, priest, and profound enthusiast for nature, Gerard Manley Hopkins, dragonflies draw flame. Yet this extinguished emperor stays in my mind long after its slowly dimmed abdomen fades away. The first sentence in my field guide is that dragonflies are the essence of summer, and there is some truth to what the poets are getting at. The intensity and brightness of them inherent to the season, the fire of the sun, and the flash of light that falls between shadows. Just to get you in the mood, they're dragonflies.
Yes, a sad mood, Stephen. But I'm very pleased because for one of my questions, which is actually the fifth question, but I'm going to start with it. I had copied out sections from that passage of your book because the thing that I wanted to say about, or ask you about, prompt you to speak about, was that although it is a book of significant themes, philosophical ones, environmental ones, it is also based on a book of very, very intimate encounters. And that was one of the very intimate encounters that I picked out. But there are a couple of others, if you'll allow me. There's one of absolutely beautiful with a much happier ending of a baby bat. So if I can read you a couple of sections of your own writing about that. The bat detector's percussion speeds up. In the vestigial light, we can just about make out the pipistrelle's mouth moving. It is calling, calls we can lip read, but only hear in translation, which is such a lovely way of describing how a bat detector works. And then the bat flies away and you say, the buzz we get is deep, the warmth of joy and relief spreading through our cold bodies, our cold bones. I feel emotional for one small life given another chance, and we all, human and bat, head our separate ways into the night. And there are lots of other examples I could mention. A grasshopper warbler, for example, that you describe, absolutely beautiful. It turns to face me to unleash its torrent of unreeling song my way. And there are lots and lots of these very, very tender, intimate moments with wildlife, which seems to me to be the way that you see the world, but you encapsulate this when you're looking for small pearl bordered fritillary and you find dark green fritillaries, and you say this: the absolute grace of being a naturalist is this: there is no wasted time, because the very fact of being outside and looking means your heart and your mind, your eyes, your fingers for typing, etc., are open to the natural world.
Yeah, totally. Great. Can you write my blurbs always?
That would be a pleasure. I'm very cheap as well.
Yeah, so when this book started, I had an idea of what this book was. I was going to go to Dorset to see marsh fritillary. I was going to go all across the country to see, the exciting summer wildlife that we have and, how it's changing. And then the world changed around me. And obviously lockdown meant that I couldn't travel. I was stranded in Bedfordshire. Lovely place. Not great for wildlife, or not great for particularly exciting wildlife. It's all right for some things. So I had to sort of rethink the entire book on the fly. So I had this great narrative thread that was running through it all of how summer was changing. So it begins in January in the Solway Firth and in Liverpool with blackcaps and natterjack toadpools, and how it was changing was always going to be the narrative that was running through it. But that was a narrative that was arcing towards bleakness and miserableness. And this isn't how I experience nature. If, you know, when we go outside, all we saw was signs of decline and loss and bad change, we wouldn't go out birding, would we? Because it would just be miserable. Yeah, nature's so full of joy. It's such an amazing experience. And yeah, there is no wasted time to going out and seeing nature. So I sort of leant back on my upbringing as a blogger. I learnt to write. I sort of taught myself to write by just writing blogs.
I read your blog for years, back when we were both newbies on Twitter, more than a decade ago.
Yeah. Okay, you read my blog. You were one of the few people who read my blog.
I loved your blog.
It really, that way to sort of begin as a writer really sort of hones you, you know, to write 1,000-word long pieces. Obviously sort of intensely descriptive. And I've always had that sort of string to my writing, that books like The Seafarers, you know, when I started it, I sort of rashly said, oh yeah, I'll write 9,000-word chapters. And then so as I began to write the first one, I was just like, I got to 1,000 words and was just like, right, how do I end it? I was like, no, wait, I'm only an eighth of the way through. Okay, this is what. So there's that adjustment process to, you know, from going from a blogger to writing a book. And in this one, it was combined sort of book length narrative with those interludes of joy, unless you're a dragonfly, of course, that sort of interleave the main narrative. And I think it gave it a slightly, well, I hope it gave it a slightly more realistic way of looking at it. Because when the principles of good writing is obviously leave out the unnecessary detail. The principle of going out in nature is that it's just awash with so much detail. So I found the things I was doing, like rescuing the baby bat with my wife, finding a dead dragonfly, going out to look for nightjars, they didn't fit within, you know, the simple standard narrative, but there's no way I couldn't include them. So yeah, I left these little 1,000-word interludes in between each chapter.
And they are quite beautiful, these moments where you stop and you're intensely focused on one encounter. I should say, for lovers of dragonflies, that there are alive and healthy dragonflies as well. There are black darters in Dumfries and Galloway. There are ruddy and common darters in Suffolk, I believe it is. And so there are plenty of living and healthy dragonflies in Stephen's writing as well. But you've mentioned another, sort of out of the order that I've chosen, that it's a book about many different things, and it's a book that can be read in many different ways. But it is, of course, a narrative of the experience of living in a time of COVID, and about moving around in the context of COVID lockdowns and whatever. And there's one moment where the restrictions begin to lift. And I was really struck by this image that you use. It reminds me of isostatic lift, land rising up after a geological weight has been removed from it. It's as if some people, having deemed the weight of the pandemic to be lifted, have risen up wildly, indulging their worst habits, as if, having left no trace since last March, they must now leave a huge trace to make up for it. I love that idea of the isostatic lift of the land, and being this pressure being lifted from human beings. How, obviously this is partly what the book is about, but how was your personal experience of lockdowns, and what did nature mean to you and your wife through this last 18 months?
So, I mean, I've had an exceptionally fortunate lockdown. You know, no one I know has died. And that feels, you know, something to be very, very grateful for. Yeah, it's been an interesting experience. So we were at my in-laws' house, or future in-laws as it was then, yeah, in Bedfordshire, with the full family, and then all of a sudden, lockdown, right, you're stuck here. 6 people, 6 cats, 3-bedroom house in the middle of nowhere. So the option was either go slightly crazy or just get out and make the most of the sort of hour-long walks we were allowed at the beginning. I mean, literary-wise, it really did focus right back in on what we were doing, and really make you think through yeah, everything. The pandemic's been an interesting thing to think about. I didn't want to write a pandemic book, but it sort of it couldn't.
How could you not?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, what's been interesting with the way that we've had lockdown easing and coming back and easing and coming back, and my job is working my day job is public facing. You get people who are suddenly really demob happy, the bonfire of the face masks, and then you have to be like, no, actually, these restrictions still exist, and then they go away, and then they come back, and you get people who behave really well and people who don't, and I think that's always going to be a case. That's always a sort of factor in human psychology. I think what we saw around the final of Euro 2020, at least particularly around the Wembley Stadium, was just suddenly the psyche going, hey, great, let's go crazy. Yeah, we've diverted quite away from wildlife here to get into psychology. But yeah, it's interesting that sudden, that epidemic of litter that began last summer, and still sort of exists now. If I go out into the countryside, you don't want to look too closely in some sort of discrete bits because you'll find horrible things there, which never used to be the case. At least I don't think used to be the case. So.
Yes, I don't know whether I have an opinion on that, but I certainly I had an experience of grieving when the strictest, but I'm very, very privileged where I live, that I'm in a place with a tremendous amount of wildlife around me. So for me, the very early lockdowns during the beautiful weather were beautiful because I was able to walk out at dawn every day and slip off into woodland and wetland and by the river and so on and see spring opening up, and it was magical. And then as people began to be on the roads, there were cars, there were everything, I felt that same thing, that there was too much going on.
One of the great things about that early time was actually the roads being quiet. Suddenly you could walk around places you'd never walked before because it'd just be dangerous. And it does plant that seed in your mind of, hang on, if there was low traffic,
what if we lived like this?
Yeah, what if the road network was suddenly remodeled for pedestrians? It'd be amazing. It'd be completely freeing. And yeah, well, that's a complete pipe dream that's never going to happen. But yeah, it is just interesting how it plants these seeds in your mind. And also, what you say about the early lockdown when the weather was beautiful, it was stunning. It was in late March and it felt like July, it felt like August. And that, on the one hand, is sort of incredibly pleasurable in the moment and incredibly terrifying if you think about it too hard. But I think hot weather encourages you not to think. So.
We'll come back to terrors. Well, in fact, in a sense, this what would have been my first question had you not touched on the dragonfly. This is from the very start of the book. You describe your descriptive writing. You describe nature almost on two levels of connection with the natural world and our perception of the natural world. One is connection between everything, the idea of food webs and ecosystems and the boundness of everything in nature, that the impossibility of separating anything. So an example of that, which is from very early on, these rhythms cannot be isolated. I can't see just the warbler by itself alone and separate from the hawthorn. I can't see the hawthorn alone and separate from the season without the rain and sun that caused its crop of shining red berries. And that's a theme that comes back again and again and again through the book, this linkedness, this boundness of everything to everything else and the indivisibility of it. But also there's a connection between all of that and what we have done and the fact that the world is shifting. And that's again a theme that you keep returning to and explore very fully in the last chapter, or the second to last. And you say everything is loaded with complexity in this time of climate change and mass extinction. Nothing is simple anymore. A bird you look at is no longer just a bird, but one of an interlinked series of forces capable of being expressed as statistics that explain the terribly restless, indecent state of the world. And that's something that really calls to me, because it's exactly how I feel, that sense of living grief about the natural world. And then you say, in the same way that no bird is just a bird anymore, no sunny summer's day is just pleasant weather. It comes freighted with anxiety for our destabilized planet. And in one sense, that's really what the book is about. It's not just a book of beautiful writing about experiences of summertime. It is a book about where summer is heading and everything with it.
You can't write nature writing right now without really, having an awareness that, climate change is happening. And, if you think about how that book might be read in 20 years' time, it could look dangerously, what's the word I'm looking for here? Naive, I think is the word I'm looking for.
Or superficial. I rail against some nature writing that is just more pretty words about nature, which we've got lots of pretty words about nature, and we, I mean, you come back to this later on, but we have to be making noise about this. Sorry, back to you with having given you a word, superficial.
Superficial. I don't like nature writing that is just description. I like nature writing that's got thought behind it as well. So, like, I mean, my ultimate inspiration for everything is Aldo Leopold, and how you were describing my book reminded me of Thinking Like a Mountain, that section in the Sand County Almanac, where he describes that the way you need to view trophic cascades, food chains, stuff like that, is like a mountain would, in the way that a wolf affects the mountain by, the wolf enables trees to grow by, hunting the deer. He expresses it much more beautifully than I have just have. So yeah, this interlinking of stuff, I find it incredible. It blows my mind. Nature is one, ecology is one of the most inspiring things that I know of. So the ending of the book was very much my way of sort of trying to look into the future without making predictions, because I think predictions generally go wrong and make you look a bit stupid. So I was trying to look into the future without making predictions. And I was also trying to write a book about climate that had no answers, because I'm, completely unqualified to offer any answers here. And if you want answers about, what to do, who to write to, what practical changes to make in your own life, there's tons of stuff out there if you want to look for it. It was the understanding of it and the understanding of the experience of it is what I wanted to communicate, particularly with that end chapter where I'm just thinking about everything that's happened and what's happening in the future. Which is sort of fundamentally, if you don't have that emotional connection to things, without love, there is nothing. And that is one of the things I wanted to focus on in the book. I just didn't want to write another bleak, miserable elegy for stuff that hasn't quite gone yet. We might as well keep the hope. And conservation is incredibly inspiring as well. So much hope. I've been emailing earlier at the start of the year members from the Turtle Dove Project, and they have such brilliant hope for the future of the species that I, didn't have, but now I've been talking to them, I do have, because, if anyone's going to save it, they're going to save it. So,
which is important to bear in mind. But sort of jumping back to what you were saying just then, yours is a book, this book goes from those intimate encounters with the bat, with the dragonfly, with the grasshopper warbler, and then sees them in the context of the mesh of other lives existing around, creating ecosystems, and then sees that in the context of what we have done to the world. And it's a powerful layering, really, to help us understand, going from the very intimate and the very personal and the connected to much, much bigger thoughts. But it's also on an easier level, let's say, a book about seasons and a book about the experience of summer and your place in summer as a boy, as a man, as a writer. And you write lots of lovely things. I'll just read you a few, if you don't mind, examples. You know this, but it bears repeating. The most obvious way we know we're circling around space, tipped to one side, is the way our summer is so obviously, joyously not winter. And then a little later in the same passage, we require light. Light is like time. It is always changing, but the pace is too slow to notice until suddenly, one evening, it is light when you leave work, or one morning, you wake up with day leaking in at the curtain's edge. It is there, unlike yesterday, and you realize with a jolt of surprise, is that the time of year? And slightly later on again, light is a substance that cannot be contained or controlled. The impact it makes is profound, yet hard to measure. As it lengthens our days, the year progresses into April, the month of change, of movement. The first half belongs in spirit to March, the second half to May, and all the time between is a time of greening and arrivals, which is just a beautiful way of describing. But it's the experience of a season, your book too.
Yes. So firstly, all that stuff about light, when you have lived a winter in southwest Scotland, you really begin to appreciate light, because it can be very, very dark.
If I may jut in briefly there, I used to, you won't be able to see, but there's a poster just there of vicuñas in the Altiplano of Bolivia. And I used to go to the very, very high mountains of Bolivia in the coldest time of year to 4,500, 5,000 meters of altitude to catch and ring James's flamingos in the alkaline lakes. And in the same way as you've just talked about with Scotland, you really come to understand why Andean people worship the sun. Because in the morning you stand waiting for the sun to hit because your bones are cold in a way you didn't imagine was possible. So back to you and light in Dumfries and Galloway.
Yes, I think you're the first person to compare Bolivia with Dumfries, but I'm going with it. That's great. So nature writing loves books about the seasons. We love almanacs, and I'm actually really interested in almanacs and the way people map out the order, how it should be done. You know, first you get this, and then this, and then this happens. And then I began to think about, going back to climate change again, began to think about how these were no longer valid or no longer right. You know, you can't talk about the first black cap in April when actually you saw your first one in January in your garden, poking around your Mahonia. I began to become really interested in how nature writing perhaps wasn't responding to the changing of the seasons in a way that, you know, the wildlife around us is changing. So it was kind of a personal challenge to myself to write an almanac or a book of the season that actually reflected what was actually going on, the deep destabilization, which obviously, when you think about it on a technical level, that's going to make it for an unstable narrative as well. But yeah, so it was an attempt at doing, you know, a seasonal book for the 21st century, a 21st century almanac.
And it is full of beautiful observations, which then lead you to profound thoughts and indeed observations of our place in the world. But before I come back to Unraveling is the title that I've given it, there is a great deal of understanding of our systems, our lives, our ecosystems unraveling, but it's also very much a book about place and an understanding of place. And oddly enough, when you first start talking about place, you're in Bedfordshire, you do talk about Bedfordshire as a place and the wildlife you experience, but you're hankering for Scotland. And I love the way you explore. I really, this struck me a great deal. My new methodology for the locked down naturalist: Google Street View, Google Earth, Ordnance Survey maps, and management plans. It's when I turn to the OS map, more real than the real thing, that the surroundings begin to make sense. It differentiates between the conifer and the deciduous. It marks out the texture of the ground, distinguishes the river from the shadow of the trees. In your mind, you're exploring place, or that your mind goes well beyond your locked down self, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it had to in the circumstances. You know, you need that freedom from exploring, walking, birding, and if your surroundings don't quite match up to that, then, you know, you need to do all of this. That was about the Wood of Cree up in Dumfries and Galloway, and for some reason I'd never been to the Wood of Cree. This was the spring I was going to go to Wood of Cree because I love pied flycatchers, redstarts and wood warblers. They are my summer woodland trinity, and they have been ever since I convinced my parents that they needed to drive me from Suffolk to Coombs Valley in Staffordshire and the Wye Forest, so that I could revise in the car Hamlet and my ICT AS level, when actually I was just revising birds, and I really didn't do very well on my ICT AS level. So basically, you know, folded into that narrative about, you know, summer woodlands is that I actually have, yeah, this emotional relationship with those three species. And this place that I've been looking forward to going to for ages and suddenly couldn't go. But I've committed myself to writing about it. So how am I going to get around that? And then, if you look at Google Street View, I mean, it's great for driving your imaginary car. I can't drive yet, so it's fantastic for driving your imaginary car. Google Earth is the one that's actually, you think you're going to get like the real thing, just pictures, but it all blurs into one. The resolution's not there, and you can't tell. Shades of green, is that ancient woodland or is that forestry pine? Really hard to tell. And that's why the OS maps, I think like many of us perhaps here in the audience, I have a thing for OS maps. My university flat bedroom was, I just stapled OS maps to the wall, because what could be better wallpaper than where you are? So yeah, I've always been interested in these representations, and the detail that you actually get out of an OS map is so much better than anything Google can offer.
But is that not slightly a metaphor for good nature writing? Because the real world is complex and difficult to interpret, and sometimes you can't see what's going on, and a good nature writer makes an OS map for you. It's distilled and representing the important bits so that you understand. I think perhaps that's the same process, the business of taking the stuff that's salient and making it obvious. Yeah, but
I would write that down in an essay if I was you.
Yeah. I don't write essays. Then you move back to Scotland, and it's very interesting that you feel uprooted. You feel as if, I think you've missed, perhaps because you had been expecting to be there and to write, but you're almost an orphan in your own home. You're lost a little bit. Our understanding of nature and our surroundings begins at home, but while it's good to be back, we're still dealing with that sense of dislocation, disorientation. We're disconnected from what should feel like home. The last 3 months in Bedfordshire don't feel real. And then there's a moment, if I can jump forward quite a way here, when you're not looking at the world. And in fact, we've been talking about that idea of telescoping from intimate encounters to complex webs of life, to the interaction between complex webs of life and the changing climate. But you're looking even beyond into the heavens. Birds link me to the world, but the night sky extends that, taking me from this small corner of town to halfway into our galaxy through sublime silences, away from known life, reminding me of the smallness of everything on Earth. I feel connected again, oriented at last. It's a lovely moment when suddenly Stephen is home.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, I love feeling small. I love the sublime of nature and feeling completely insignificant. I'm just a psychologist in there. Have your own field day. But that was I was stood on the steps outside our house, looking down the street above the streetlights, and Saturn and Jupiter were aligned with the road. We get a fantastic night sky around here. It's not like anything else I've seen. The dislocation was strange, because when we arrived home, I literally couldn't remember what kitchen cupboard things went in. And it's amazing how 3 months away that knowledge just like vanishes out of your head. Dumfries in summer, when it's not raining, is actually really quite nice. It has an amazing micro season. So I think this is a Japanese concept, the micro season, where they sort of divide the year up into, I think it's 72 different,
Lev Perikian has just published a new book on the micro-seasons in London.
Someone always gets there before you, don't
you? Lev is a clever boy.
Yes, he is. And my favourite Dumfries micro-season is the time when the lesser blackback gull chicks fledge and walk about the town streets looking utterly bemused and befuddled and confused. I mean, this is slightly, anthropomorphic, obviously. They're just gulls doing about their gully business. But I remember vividly one stood outside the Caven's Arms in town, which is the Camera Award-winning pub since forever, just like looking at the door as if, just like, how do I get in there? They cause chaos. It's great. It's delightful to watch as a gull fan and as a fan of people getting stressed by gulls, because, it is always amusing to watch. So I was really looking forward to that. And then when we came back, we had no reason to actually go into the town centre. So, my markers had gone, and we'd arrived back, pretty much the only thing left singing was the grasshopper warbler on the edge of town. So yeah, it's basically, at the end of Bedfordshire, I began to think on my daily walks, I'd be walking home and I'd think, walking home to home. I was like, no, not home, but feels like home, which I never expected to feel like. So coming back to home in Dumfries, it was a strange experience. And I remember the first thing my neighbour said to me, which was, "It's a bloody mess." And I have no idea what it was referring to. If it was the garden, it's probably the garden, or the political situation or the pandemic or whatever. So it was a strange experience, and I don't wish to experience it again, but I might as well be glad I experienced it. There's things to learn in it.
Much to learn, but you almost a theme that comes up. You might not realize this, but something that comes up is through the book is the experience of shifting edges, of movement, of things not actually belonging in places. So you don't know which cupboard to put a cup in. But there's also a theme of edges not quite being there. So back at home, you say, towns are built to shelter us from nature rather than bring it in. I'm grateful that Dumfries is small, that a river runs through it, and that the edges are permeable, and that wildlife finds a way to slip into our urban settings. And then slightly further afield on the Solway Firth is an amphibious place, a complicated mix of water and land. It so happens that the southern end of Scotland, marks the furthest north of the natterjack toad, the natterjack toad comes in Britain. It is a species of edges, the edge of the country, the edge between water and land, the edge of knowledge. And you discuss the same in the context of what I would call Saltmarsh and you call Merse in Scotland, that idea of slippery boundaries and the unrealness of things because they're always melting into other things.
Yes. That is a great way of putting it. I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that last year I got into ghost stories again. And suddenly becomes really interested in how, one of the inevitable conclusions of the state of nature at the moment of everything declining is that we are just going to end up with a bunch of edges. And the center of nature, if you will, is just being hollowed out by declines and changes. But I also became interested in how things slip and how things hauntings, really. And that is partly why it got the subtitle it did, Ghosts of Summers Past, Present and Future, because you can play a sort of grim game of, you're the next one gone, walking around Bedfordshire with 3 corn buntings thinking, you've not got long left, have you, mate? And thinking, oh yes, the ghost of the past is the turtle dove, the ghost of the present is these corn buntings, and then the ghost of the future, I don't really want to think about it, but so many potential things. So one got into hauntings and edges.
Well, you certainly did. A lot of your writing is about these slippery places that aren't quite one thing or another. And that brings me on to the next question, really, which is, as I mentioned it earlier, that it is a book about unraveling inherently. It is a book about things which are wearing thin. It is things that are disappearing, things that are under strain, things that are changing, because it is a book about summer in the context of climate change. So to touch on a few of these, of the phenological misfits, the pied flycatcher seems to be one of the most affected. They are dropping out of sync with a summer that arrives too early for them. So just before I go on to other things, tell us about phenological misfits and pied flycatchers.
So phenological mismatch, and I'm just flicking through to find the actual numbers because I can't remember the numbers very well. So phenological mismatch is the way that, in this context, is migrant birds returning to find that their peak food source is no longer there, or it's emerged before they arrived. So just to get you the data, pied flycatchers are returning in spring 1.4 days earlier every year, but the peak demand for the peak caterpillar mass day is 12 days earlier every year. And a pied flycatcher that has to migrate 3,000 miles, that distance isn't getting shorter. So you can begin to see the ways that these aren't meeting up. Now, the pied flycatcher is not supposed to lay its eggs for peak caterpillar availability. The idea is that you want peak caterpillar availability for about the 10th day of your hatched young, because that is when the young need most food. And obviously, this is falling out of sync. On one particularly hot year, it was 27 days late, the pied flycatchers were, behind peak caterpillars. And yeah, so the effect is that there is less food for them. And the effect of that is that the adults are in less good condition. They can't provide for their chicks less well, and they're providing less for their chicks. So the chicks are in less good condition to fledge. And yeah, this is sort of malign elegance to it. You just change one thing, like a recipe, really. You take the salt out and it begins to go completely different. So yeah, this is part of it. So I'm actually really interested in phenological mismatch, and I sort of probably blame Aldo Leopold for it as well. And then when I was looking into phenological mismatch for pied flycatchers, I began to think, how is it for redstarts? And for redstarts, it's sort of the reverse. We're looking at the phenology of the Sahel and whether it's been a wet year or a dry year. And if it's been a wet year, a wet summer in the Sahel, it's going to be really good for pied flycatchers and people. And if it's a dry year in the Sahel, then it's drought and starvation for pied flycatchers, redstarts, and millions of people. So yeah, like John Muir's universe of things, you tug at one thing and it's tied to everything else.
Again, where we began, it's that idea that, as you say, everything is woven together, and if one thing's out of kilter, and you say, I mean, you talk about the fact the beigeification, if I can coin a phrase, of nature, that we're heading towards a situation in which everything becomes a generalist. Surveys have shown that the species doing well are the generalists and the short distant migrants, the less highly strung, the less dependent on things being as they expect. It seems as though our woods, our world, as well as becoming more silent, are becoming plainer, less interesting, less able to provide a home to the niche species, which is one of the tragedies of the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, so only earlier today, I was cast my eye over Twitter and saw a Twitter thread about willow tits and how actually providing bird feeders and nest boxes for willow tits are one of the worst things you can do, because it attracts the generalists that push the willow tits out of the way. And I don't know what you'd call the willow tit there, the hyper specialist, the shy, the introvert, the one that really can't handle competition. I mean, I identify strongly.
I was about to say I'm a willow tit, totally, 100%. Yeah.
So yeah, and this is partly why, I guess what I'm going back to is that when I offered no answers, in the book, an answer for one thing is not an answer for other things. Conservation is such a fine-grained, incredible meshwork of individual solutions that don't necessarily work for other things. So yeah, you might think that, oh, willow tits are declining, I'll put up some nest boxes, and no, it just adds coal tits, which outcompete the willow tits. It's so bleak, isn't it?
It's hard to be positive.
It is, but then I remember the first time I ever saw a willow tit, which was at Potterick Car, bizarrely on a bird feeder. And Potterick Car is an amazing place to feel hope, because it's sandwiched between an industrial estate and the East Coast Main Line. It's like a triangle of reed beds and paths and water, and it's one of those amazing testaments to how nature can survive and thrive when, by all rights, it shouldn't have. And indeed, not just the generalists, but things like willow tits as well.
Well, willow tits, really, the only places they're doing well are post-industrial landscapes, which are scrubbing up, because it's exactly the habitat that they like. But taking the unraveling to the personal level, you acknowledge your own place in it. You say, there is a selfishness at the heart of my sadness here. Birding is my mental and physical refuge from whatever else is happening. It levels my moods out, keeps me feeling sane, and gives me great joy when I have one of those semi-regular encounters with a wild animal that leaves me thrilled and reminded of my place in the world. The unraveling weighs heavily on you, Stephen Rutt.
Yes, yeah, it does. I mean, it can't not. In the way that today weighs heavily for being swiftless after many months of swifts. The idea that one day maybe swifts won't come back, like, I don't want to live in that world. That sounds a bit emo, doesn't it? We have Dumfries. In fact, particularly my housing estate on the edge of Dumfries is amazing for swallows, swifts, and house martins, and we get sand martins as well going over. Without them, I would not know. I mean, without sand martins, I wouldn't know spring was here. Without swallows and house martins, I wouldn't know summer would be less. It wouldn't be the same. It's such a profound joy. And obviously swallows and house martins exist for their own reasons. They don't exist to give me pleasure. It's just what I take from them in a non-extractive, non-damaging way. I just get joy from it. Yeah. And also, swallows connect us to Aristotle. One swallow does not make a summer. That comes from him. And that was, the start of European civilization, people hanging around outside on sunny days in spring, looking at birds and thinking, what does that mean? So it's also nice to know that I'm not the only person doing this. It's not just us. They were doing it ages ago, and they're going to be doing it ages in the future as well, I hope.
Ages ago also, everyone was agrarian in some way or other. Everyone had an intimate relationship with nature. There was no chemist down the road to buy your medicines from. There was no supermarket to buy your food from. You had to have an understanding. Almost everyone in society would have grown food to some extent, would have lived in the outdoors to some extent, would have gathered herbs for whatever purpose themselves. And so an understanding of nature was a necessary and intimate thing. So the arrival of swallows would actually have been much more redolent with meaning than just, oh, wow, they're back. It would have been a micro season of significance.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. Have you read Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, just for a completely strange interlude?
No, I haven't. Okay,
so that is really powerful on that joining point, perhaps, between the agrarian and the non-agrarian. The scenes that Maggie O'Farrell writes about going out and collecting herbs and things like that, and also growing up with pigs and stuff. That is a really powerful way of saying what you've just said, but over the course of the novel instead of 20 seconds.
But it's the biggest single thing that's happened to modern humanity, is that we have divorced ourselves from the natural world because we have moved into cities and moved into an electronic world, and a world where most of us grow our own food, and it's at the cost of our understanding and our relationship with nature. But don't forget, by the way, before I carry on with my own questions, that people are very welcome to ask Stephen questions. And so if you want to pop a question in the question and answer, please feel free to do so. But we've got one comment so far from David Bradley, who says, not a question, just to say, I've really enjoyed all of Stephen's books so far. So we have a rapturous applause there from David Bradley. But if anyone else wants to comment or to question, please do pop your question in the question and answer, and we'll bring them to Stephen shortly. There is an irony in the unraveling of nature, the way that you and I, you're younger than I am, but we both had a number of years of living with nature and seen her comings and her goings, and the fizzing of the red wings in my sky in October. Well, the first thing that'll happen for me within the next 3 weeks, I'll be hearing pink-footed geese back, and you will be just before me. In fact, you'll have them 2-3 days before me. Sorry?
I'll let you know when they're coming.
Yes, absolutely. Well, usually I see on Twitter and I know which day they're going to be here. Last year we had our first arrival on the 6th of September. So very, very soon indeed. So they'll be with you very soon indeed. We've lived with the rhythms of nature and we have an understanding of them, but they are unquestionably unraveling, the phenological mismatch that you're talking about. And yet, things that are arriving. Now, this fills me with terror and horror. You talk about it in the book, about people saying, oh, I saw a swallow in December. And very often it's a sort of, I remember seeing some young twitchers being really excited because they'd seen a December swallow. And I just thought, Oh, that's terrifying. And you touch on this with egrets, and they come up a couple of times. And the first time, it's almost as a positive thing. You say it's a rare thing, a special thing indeed, to see wild animals of any description making such geography-defying movements to set up new populations, new outposts in new parts of the world. A rare example of good news in this warming world. But later, talking to Stephen Moss, who, bless him, today has tested positive for COVID. And so we wish him a speedy recovery, and his whole family. I think 2 of his children have had COVID, and he's caught it from them, bless him. But Stephen, if you're out there, we wish you a speedy recovery. He said, you are talking to him about changes in the nature of the Somerset levels where he lives. It is a concern of his and mine that the new species colonizing the area are almost a distraction, that the novelty factor of the unfamiliar casts a shadow over those that were more familiar, less attention grabbing, and gradually dwindling away. I do worry about this in conservation, this obsession with releasing big stuff, with the new big stuff that's arriving, that's terribly sexy and exciting, while we neglect the quiet and the corn buntings and the willow tits and the spotted flycatchers that in living memory were common.
Yeah.
And nobody really does anything.
No, so I mean, going back to one of the things you quoted from me earlier about like the moral complexity, everything is loaded with complexity. You can't think, oh, egrets, lovely to have them. They bred in Dumfries and Galloway for the first time last year, and not think, what does this mean? With things like spotted flycatchers, I'm not currently aware of any conservation work going on to save them. Are you aware?
No, none whatsoever, actually. No, and they've declined drastically.
Drastically, yeah. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's kind of symptomatic of a landscape level wide disaster that we're sort of sleepwalking into. The Sunset Levels is a really interesting example. Again, it was a place I really wanted to go, couldn't because of lockdown. But they've made essentially this landscape out of old carrot fields and peat workings and stuff. They've turned it into this amazing wetland. They basically made a landscape for egrets, and that is lovely. It's great. We're going to attract new species, and the more species, the better. Fundamentally, we love biodiversity. That's biodiversity in a nutshell. But at the same time, I would quite like the rest of the countryside to be turned into a spotted flycatcher paradise, a corn bunting paradise. What you see going on with NEP, the rewilding project in Sussex, is that they've sort of accidentally turned their estate into a paradise for turtle doves. But I don't know how I feel about this white stork project, the reintroduction of the white stork. I don't understand the purpose of it. There are so many more pressing, important, declining species, and then chucking out this gigantic, charismatic distraction, as far as I can see. I think if you want a rewilding project, let it wild itself. If you're going to introduce,
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm absolutely with you on that one, and I don't even believe there's evidence that storks were here in the first place. I really,
not numbers. They've just been chucked out either. If you're going to have a rewilding project, then you need a top level predator. You need something like a lynx, and until you've got that full level, the full trophic cascade of nature, then it's not proper. It's not right.
You can't think like a mountain if you don't have top predators.
Yeah. And obviously, we're never going to get wolves back. I think that's just, a pipe dream too far. But lynx would be perfect. And it's a shame that, no one has quite had the gumption or the necessary diplomacy to make that happen. Such a shame, because diplomacy is a massive part of conservation that I think people forget. But yeah, chucking out white storks, which are again another generalist predator. They love to eat a frog. They love to raid a bird.
They love to eat our most declining amphibians, which the amphibians are declining enormously fast. But we're getting almost. I agree with you that there are plenty of big headline distractions in conservation. It's very easy to sell something new and big and make it sound as if you're doing conservation, when in fact conservation is about protecting what's there and allowing it to be wilding. And that brings me, I suppose, neatly to the fact that in addition to it being a book about unraveling, it's also a book about mourning. I mean, you say the subtitle, Ghosts of Summers, Past, Present and Future. There is a lot of real sadness and grieving. I mean, perhaps the saddest of all is the corncrake. The corncrake that you think you hear, but you don't hear, which is, it's heartbreaking. But earlier in the passage about corncrakes, you say, it has become a bird in the past tense, which is just heartbreaking. I should add that I was releasing corncrakes on Friday last week. They're from the Natural England sponsored captive breeding program. We released 37 corncrakes in the fens the other day. So we're doing a little bit to try it. Pensthorpe and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and Natural England and various others are attempting to re-establish corncrakes as an English breeding bird. But the saddest of all is when you describe thinking you might have heard a corncrake. I traced the field with my binoculars, heads of grass and dock and dandelion waving in the breeze. It wasn't a surprise to not see it, but it was a surprise to hear the next cracks from a wall. I scanned and traced it to a single starling. Starlings are capable of long memories for sounds that they can repeat. It was mimicking the corncrake that was once in this field and is presumably there no longer. So I don't know if it was from last year or generations before, but this is the closest I have come to a corncrake in the decades since I saw that teardrop head between the dock leaves of North Uist. I came close to a reproduction, the past tense bird. I found that heartbreaking. The idea that a corncrake's spirit is still there in the imitation of a starling, but the bird itself may well not be there, nor ever again.
Yeah. Thank you for reintroducing corncrakes. Thank you for releasing them. That's great. And corncrakes are such an unsexy species. They're the opposite of a distraction because you never see them. They're only a distraction when you're trying to look for them and you can hear them and can't find them because they're invisible. How you introduced an invisible bird, I don't know, but well done.
It's not me. I'm merely a peripheral player, but there are some very, very cool people releasing 100 corncrakes a year here in East Anglia. One of them for the last 2 years has sung just outside my house. And there comes a point where you stop liking corncrakes quite so much when they sing all night outside your house. But I do adore the little blighters.
No, it is a wonderful species, the sort of species you couldn't invent. And yeah, although I was thankful to the starling for providing me with that sentence, even if, I read it out loud to my wife and it made her cry.
Yeah, it is. It got me. It really did. It caught in my throat. It's absolutely beautiful. But you say a similar thing about where you cleverly moved from the high summer quietening of the birds to the bigger picture quietening of the birds. So this is a slightly longer passage, if you'll let me. Silence is a haunting thing, summer silence particularly because it performs a trick on us. It seems as if things drain away at what should be, according to our human calendar, the height of activity when the breeding birds should be flourishing. It's as if we turned away for a moment and when we looked back, they had vanished. Now there you're talking about the fact that birds go quiet in the summer and become shy, but then you springboard from that to something much more sinister in the next paragraph. More summer silences turning into permanent absences. Sound is, I think, my worst, my dullest sense, yet it is incredibly important. There's a sort of grief reported by aging ornithologists who can no longer hear the highest pitch of bird sounds, the grasshopper warblers or goldcrests, effectively losing these species. That sadness is coming for us all. But it's not just coming that we will lose the ability to hear the birds, it's also that the birds won't be there for us to hear.
Yeah, it's a perfect summation. But it's interesting because as a relatively young person, I've always been aware of climate change. It's just always been a thing in my life. I still remember when I first heard about it because I was reading the Times newspaper in my granny's living room, and I asked what the words Kyoto Protocol meant, and that's where I first learned about it. So the acknowledgement of it, the grief you get from watching something be perfect and then fall apart, that's never quite happened for me, because I've always been aware of it as a changing, tarnished thing, and that we have to sort of, love and bear witness to the world in all of its tarnished glory, and hope that there is a way out of it. And actually, what gives me massive amounts of hope are children. Greta Thunberg and the Friday school strikers for climate change. They are the most sort of inspirational, thing that's happened, possibly in conservation in the last, 5-10 years. They give me great hope. And whereas, I had to learn it when I was 5 or 6 by asking what Kyoto Protocol meant, they, won't ever have that. They won't need to know what Kyoto Protocol is, because they're just growing up in that world, that changing world. And it's amazing how clear their vision is, I think, for that.
That's interesting, because it's the last two things that I wanted to touch on are in a way about hope. One of them is directly about hope, but before that, you touch quite a bit actually on what wild means to us, the good stuff, and sometimes not quite the good stuff. So that at one moment there's a bad thing. Ticks are the trouble with the wild. We want that seductive magic, but as in all stories, seductive magic has its downsides. Sometimes we have to pay for it in blood. You have a traumatic experience with a tick.
Too traumatic, because this happened again 2 days ago.
Oh, did it? I had one last week. Yes.
Yeah. Something about my belly, they just love it. They utterly creep me out.
Do they? Oh. Yes. Never live in South America. Never live in South America. You get them all the time. I'm now just sort of used to them. But there is much more about the wild that is good. So this is on your own relationship with the wild. The wild is subjective and hard to define, but it is important for me to be somewhere open, somewhere our physical influence recedes and the lives of other species play a bigger role, to feel as if I am in a place that is shared, not dominated. And then continuing, slightly changing from that, but I love this idea that wilderness may have gone, but wildness has not, which is a fiercely optimistic thing to say. You say wilderness is the non-human, it precludes us, whereas wildness, that tangible riot of unconstrained life, colonized this man-made habitat, this line cut through forest and moor, along which trains used to hurtle. Wildness gives us the rush-edged loch, the wildflower-spangled banks. This is what is important. There's that very clear idea that the wild is potent.
Yes.
And the wild can, if we give it the chance.
Yeah, absolutely. So I last summer I was at Moreton Castle, which is just above the town of Thornhill and Dumfries in Galloway, and it's this amazing 13th, 14th, 15th century ruin. I'm again bad with numbers, and it's fallen apart. It's literally just the shell of the walls and a little bit of internal structure. And there's an oubliette prison type thing inside it. And Miranda and I, we looked over the side, and it was crawling in frogs and toads and a newt that was down there in the sort of damp, dark, disgusting depths. I think a crow's nest had fallen down into it as well. And yeah, you suddenly think that, this is not our castle anymore. This is, a structure for amphibians. And, if I left Moreton Castle, I would look out over the Loafer Hills, which are, grass moorlands. They burn them every spring, which is vaguely distressing to see and breathe in. And think, yes, if I was to look at that without knowing, you'd think, yes, wilderness, all that untamed land, and actually it's really deeply managed. The wild spirit of nature is what sort of, hacks that or breaks the system, or finds its own way of surviving where, you know, we didn't ask it to. So the best place I know around here for wildflowers is a disused rail bank. I mean, I'm a terrible botanist. You know, I only saw eyebright for the first time at the weekend, and now I'm suddenly seeing it everywhere.
It's just magical, like, magical.
Have I not been looking? Have I just been assuming it's lesser stitchwort all this time? My excuse is that I'm looking for birds which are in the wrong direction.
Dare I tell you, Stephen, that eyebright is not a single species, and that there are many species in the genus Euphrasia, and you've now gone down a rabbit hole of identifying Euphrasias.
And I've probably gone down a massive wrong in every correct botanist's regard of me, which I obviously don't want to happen. But yeah, these disused railway banks in Dumfries and Galloway. Do you know the 39 Steps by John Buchan?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So Hanny gets a train to Newton Stewart, and his train goes through these now disused railway banks, railway lines, which were shut by beaching. And on the one hand, I see this amazing semi-rewilded structure that, you know, plants and dragonflies, amphibians, and now birds, you know, beginning to exploit and use for their own ends. But also the sadness for, I would really have liked to get a train to Newton Stewart, so then I wouldn't have to use my car. Or obviously I don't drive. My wife has to drive me all the time to Newton Stewart. Yeah. Again, moral complexity. I sort of love how it's been rewilded and regret the fact that it needed to be rewilded in the first place and isn't just still, you know, a functioning train line. Again, if we want to live in a low carbon future, maybe, you know, hamstringing us to the car and, you know, getting rid of public transport as we did was such a terrible decision. Massive sort of historical irony, you know, in all this.
It was indeed, but the positive that comes from it in your book is that nature finds a way. Nature will wildness is always a possibility. In it just came into my head, in The God of Small Things, in the opening passage, Arundhati Roy says, I'm looking out at my own crazy garden at the moment, but she says, the wild, overgrown garden was full of the whisper and scurry of small lives. Wherever we give it the chance, there are small lives. But the final point that I wanted to make, to probe with you, is that it is actually, despite the loss of the corncrake, despite the decline of the pied flycatcher and the wood warbler and the redstart, it is you are defiantly hopeful at the end. You say, I am a reformed nihilist about climate change and our declining wildlife. My underlying current of love for wildlife fuels my hope, stops me from recoiling further away from this wounded world. And then you almost stick a flag in the ground as a writer, that here's what I can do as a writer. Here is the power of writing. One motivation for me spending this long summer writing about wildlife is that I have a belief that eco-literacy is essential, that it will underpin any successful attempt at saving the world from ourselves. Any writing about wildlife and the landscape is writing about climate too. Even tangentially, they are intertwined. And finally, there is no understanding without first noticing, observing, responding. Bearing witness seems a good, hope-filled first step. It suggests a purpose, a defiance to letting this become normal. And that brings us back to your dragonfly. Noticing, observing, responding, which is the platform from which you bear witness.
Yes. That was put fairly perfectly. What gives me great hope is that as naturalists, we go out, we observe, we notice, and that is fuel for conservationists. We provide the raw data for them to go out and do their little hope-filled acts of, you know, paying attention to the lives of invisible corncrakes, and hopefully someone in the future spot flycatchers, like people are doing with willow tits, to learn, you know, the tiny incremental things that don't work for them. Naturalists, us, the community of birdwatchers, the community of noticers, the community of people who go out and pay attention to the small scurrying lives of small things in wild places, it can't not give you hope, surely. You know, I mean, I used to be a nihilist. Yeah, I used to think I was a brilliant, miserable teenager. I used to think that this was the inevitable course of things was absolute despair and disaster, and it's not productive, and it's not really based in reality either. And ultimately, yeah, if I genuinely felt that, then I would have just have given up bird watching and turned to alcoholism or something. Any sort of blissful oblivion. Yeah, nihilism doesn't work. Having faith in conservationists who, in fact, as I've written my 3 books, they always amaze me what they can work out, what they can discover, and how they got on doing things. So when I was doing the Seafarers, it's inevitable to confront the plastics crisis, and a lot of the reading was absolutely horrible. Some truly startling, depressing statistics and facts. But it is the way that people think, right, work it out, solve the problem, define the problem, work out these depressing numbers, and then do something about it. And it's that and do something about it that conservation has that, is what gives me the hope.
I'm, for one, glad that you didn't turn to the bottle and instead you turned to writing, to sharing your passion for nature, because it gives us a great deal of opportunity to read about beautiful things. And don't forget, people, if you are, please, I hope that you will read this lovely book and that you will do so through the link that has been popped in the chat by David, because that will give you the opportunity not only to buy Stephen's latest book, and indeed, as I say, his previous books, Wintering and the Seafarers, but also it will give you the opportunity to make a donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust, for which we will be very, very grateful. Stephen, I kept you talking for an hour and a quarter. Anything final that you want to say to the assembled company, or indeed to me?
Yes, buying your book through Wild Sounds and donating to Norfolk Wildlife Trust is great, because not only does it support me more than buying it through alternative online retailers, but if you support me and also support the existence of the scrape at Clyde Marshes, then 15-year-old me will be very, very, very happy.
Well, a huge thank you to 15-year-old Stephen, and also to grown-up Stephen, and very many congratulations to you on your recent marriage. We're delighted for you and Miranda, and wish you a very happy life together, watching wildlife, sharing a joy in those intimate encounters, and continuing to tell us about it. Thanks, Stephen, very much. Thank you to everybody who's here. Please keep an eye on our website, which is cleycalling.com, where you'll be able to find out about future events, both in-person events, because we're now doing them at Cley, at our Cley Marshes Reserve, and also plenty more, especially as autumn and winter come along and we're back indoors again a lot more often on cold winter evenings. We'll be doing a lot more talks online as well. So a huge thank you to Stephen for being with us this evening and for your 3 books, and thank you to everyone who's been with us. A safe evening to you all, and good night.